January 5th, 1945. The Trianon Palace Hotel, Versailles, France. It is a bitter, relentless cold. The kind of cold that ignores the heavy velvet drapes and the stone walls of the old hotel. But in the private office of the Supreme Commander, the temperature is not the issue. The room is thick with smoke. A haze of Chesterfield cigarettes hangs in the stale air, clinging to the wool uniforms, stinging the eyes. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sits alone at his desk. To the public, he is Ike, the smiling Kansas-born father figure of the alliance, the man who holds the British and Americans together with a grin and a handshake. But tonight, the grin is gone. His face is grey, the colour of old ash. The bags under his eyes are deep bruises of exhaustion. He is battling high blood pressure, tinnitus, and the crushing weight of a decision that is tearing him apart from the inside out. On the desk in front of him, amidst the clutter of intelligence reports and casualty lists from the Ardennes, sits a single sheet of paper. It is a draft, a cable. He picks up his pen. He stares at the words. Outside these walls, the Battle of the Bulge is still raging. In the snow-covered forests of Belgium, 19,000 Americans have already died. But the war Eisenhower is fighting in this room isn't against the Germans. It isn't against Hitler, it is against his own allies. Across the room, the silence is broken only by the scratching of the pen and the distant, muffled ringing of a telephone that no one answers. Eisenhower is trembling, not from the cold, from rage, a pure, white-hot anger that he has suppressed for 2.5 years. He looks at the draft. It is addressed to General George Marshal in Washington. But the target is sitting in a tactical trailer 200 miles north. The cable is an ultimatum. It is a firing squad in diplomatic language. It says, effectively, it is him or it is me. Choose. If Eisenhower sends this cable, the command structure of the Western Front collapses. The British and American governments will be plunged into a political crisis that will dwarf the military one. The offensive into Germany will halt. The alliance might fracture permanently. Eisenhower's hand hovers over the paper. He is the supreme commander. He is the man of compromise. But tonight, the compromise is dead. He is about to fire Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. To understand why the most powerful soldier in the Western world was about to commit career suicide to get rid of Britain's greatest war hero, we have to go back. We have to strip away the newsreel footage of cheering troops and shaking hands. We have to look at the map, and we have to look at the egos. 3 weeks earlier, December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, the Ghost Front. For months, Allied intelligence had been drunk on its own success. They believed the Wehrmacht was broken. They believed the Germans had no gas, no planes, and no fight left. They treated the war like a foregone conclusion. The Ardennes sector was used as a nursery for green American divisions and a retirement home for battered ones. It was quiet, it was safe, until 5:30 that morning, when the horizon erupted. 200,000 German troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, and 1,600 artillery pieces slammed into the American line. It was a failure of intelligence that rivaled Pearl Harbor. The American front didn't just bend. In places, it evaporated. The German plan was insane, but it was working. They drove a massive steel wedge through the Allied lines, heading west toward the port of Antwerp. Within 48 hours, the battlefield had been sliced in half. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, was headquartered in Luxembourg City, to the south of the German thrust, but 2 of his 3 armies, the massive U.S. 1st Army and the U.S. 9th Army, were located to the north of the German breakthrough. The communication lines were cut, the roads were severed by panzers. Bradley was a general who could not reach his own men. He was shouting into a void. In Versailles, Eisenhower looked at the map and saw the reality. He saw that Bradley had lost control of the northern battlefield, not through incompetence, but through geography. The German Bulge was a physical wall separating the commander from his troops. So, on December 20th, Eisenhower made a decision. It was a cold, pragmatic, military decision. He called Bradley. The conversation was brief and painful. Eisenhower ordered that the 2 orphaned American armies, the 1st and the 9th, be stripped from Bradley's command. He was giving them to the man who commanded the northern sector. He was giving them to Field Marshal Montgomery. On paper, this was the only move. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was already in the north. His communications were intact. He was the logical choice to coordinate the defense of the northern shoulder. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought by men. And to the American commanders, to Omar Bradley and George Patton, this order was a slap in the face. It felt like a vote of no confidence. It felt like the Americans were bleeding and dying, and the British were being handed the reins of power. Bradley was humiliated. He argued, he pleaded, but Eisenhower held firm. "It's temporary, Brad," he said, "just until we close the gap." Bradley swallowed his pride. He obeyed the order. But Field Marshal Montgomery did not see this as a temporary emergency measure. He did not see it as a desperate fix. He saw it as a coronation. You have to understand the chemistry of Bernard Law Montgomery. He was a man of immense talent and even more immense vanity. He was the victor of El Alamein. He was methodical, cautious, and disciplined. To him, war was a tidying-up exercise. He viewed the Americans as enthusiastic cowboys, brave, certainly, and rich in supplies, but tactically reckless and strategically illiterate. For months, Montgomery had been lobbying for a single ground commander. He wanted one man to control all the armies, American and British, and of course he believed that man should be him. When Eisenhower handed him the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, Montgomery believed he had finally won the argument. He believed Eisenhower had admitted his own incompetence and handed the war over to the professional. The moment he took command on December 20th, the atmosphere changed. Montgomery strode into the American headquarters like a visiting headmaster, taking over a chaotic kindergarten. He didn't ask for situation reports, he gave lectures. He criticized American positions. He rearranged American divisions without consulting American generals. He signaled London, "I have taken charge of the whole northern flank. I am tidying up the mess." The mess. Those words filtered back to Bradley's HQ. They filtered back to Patton. Patton, commanding the Third Army in the south, was already in a murderous mood. He was fighting his way through the snow to relieve Bastogne. When he heard that Montgomery was tidying up the American armies, Patton told his staff, "If I have to serve under that little limey fart, I will resign my commission." But the crisis was real. The Germans were still advancing, so the Americans held their tongues. They focused on the enemy. Throughout late December, the battle turned. The Americans held at Elsenborn Ridge. They held at St. Vith long enough to ruin the German timetable. Patton performed his miracle pivot and broke the siege of Bastogne. The German fuel ran out, the skies cleared, and the Allied air power returned. By early January 1945, the panic was over. The Bulge was being pinched shut. The Wehrmacht was retreating, leaving their equipment burning on the icy roads. It was a victory. A messy, bloody, terrifying victory, won largely by American grit and logistics. This was the moment for unity. This was the moment for a gracious commander to say, "Well done, hand back the borrowed armies," and look toward the Rhine. But Montgomery couldn't do it. He had to claim the narrative. January 7th, 1945, Zonhoven, Belgium. The setting is a small, nondescript room in Montgomery's tactical headquarters. Outside, the Ardennes winter is still biting, snow piling up against the windows. Inside, the room is packed with war correspondents from every major Allied newspaper. Montgomery enters. He is wearing his trademark beret, his battle dress crisp. He looks relaxed, cheerful, even. He carries no notes. He doesn't need them. He knows exactly what story he wants to tell. He begins to speak, and with every sentence he digs the grave of the Allied command deeper. He describes the Battle of the Bulge not as a desperate defensive stand by American troops, but as a strategic trap that he had set. He implies that he foresaw the German attack when everyone else was blind. "As soon as I saw what was happening," he tells the reporters, "I took certain steps to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river." He describes the battle as if he were a puppeteer yanking the strings of the American armies. "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. Finally, it was put into battle with a bang. The battle has been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled." Think about that word, interesting. At that exact moment, American graves registration units were hacking into the frozen ground to bury 19,000 boys. And Montgomery called it interesting. But he didn't stop there. He went on to praise the American soldier, but in the tone of a man patting a dog on the head. A brave fighting man, he called the GI. But the context was clear. The Americans were brave muscle. The British provided the brains. He made it sound as though the British had saved the Americans from total disaster, as though Eisenhower had panicked, and he, Montgomery, had arrived just in time to prevent a rout. The correspondents scribbled furiously. They knew a scoop when they heard one. This wasn't a briefing. It was a victory lap. When the transcript hit the wires, the reaction was nuclear. The story broke first on the BBC. The British press, starved for a victory after years of playing second fiddle to the American juggernaut, went wild. The headline screamed, "Monty saves the day. British take charge." In Washington, D.C., General George Marshal read the reports. Marshal was a man of ice, rarely showing emotion. But when he read the transcript, his face hardened. He knew the mood in Congress. He knew the mood of the American public. They were watching their sons die by the thousands, and now they were being told by a British field marshal that their army was incompetent. Marshal sent a cable to Eisenhower. It was short, blunt, and terrifying. It essentially said, "The American public will not stand for this. If this is the attitude of the British command, we may need to rethink the entire structure of the alliance." In Luxembourg, Omar Bradley read the transcript. Bradley was a mild-mannered man. He looked like a schoolteacher, but he had reached his breaking point. He had swallowed the humiliation of losing his armies. He had swallowed the insults. But this public preening, this rewriting of history while the bodies were still warm? Bradley walked to his desk. He called his staff. His voice was shaking. "I cannot serve under him," Bradley said, "and I will not." He began to draft his resignation. Let's pause and consider the stakes here. This is January 1945. The war is not over. The Allies have to cross the Rhine. They have to conquer the heart of Germany. And the commander of the largest American army group is writing his resignation letter because he refuses to work with the British commander. Patton, predictably, was louder. "I told you so," he roared. He told Bradley that if Ike didn't fire Monty, they should both quit and tell the American people why. The shockwave traveled back to Versailles, to that cold, smoke-filled room where Eisenhower sat. Eisenhower had spent the entire war being the diplomat. He had soothed egos. He had mediated disputes. He had allowed Montgomery to be rude, tardy, and insubordinate because he believed Montgomery was a necessary fighter. But now the math had changed. Montgomery had become a liability that outweighed his assets. Eisenhower realized that if he kept Montgomery, he would lose Bradley. He would lose Patton. He would lose the confidence of the U.S. Army. The time for diplomacy was over. It was time for the butcher's bill. We are back in the room. January 5th, the Trianon Palace Hotel. Eisenhower finishes reading the draft. He looks at his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith. Smith is Ike's hatchet man. Tough, ulcerous, zero patience for nonsense. "It has to go, Ike," Smith says. "We can't patch this one up." Eisenhower nods. He dictates the final version of the cable to Marshal. The language is precise. Eisenhower states that the differences between him and Montgomery are now unbridgeable. He criticizes Montgomery's failure to follow orders, his constant stalling, and now his toxic public statements. Then, the ultimatum. Eisenhower writes that if the British insist on retaining Montgomery in his current capacity, he, Eisenhower, will request to be relieved of his command. He knows exactly what this means. President Roosevelt will not fire Eisenhower. The American public loves Ike. The war effort depends on him. If this cable lands on Marshall's desk, Marshall will call Churchill, and Churchill will have no choice. He cannot afford to lose the American alliance. He cannot afford to lose the Lend-Lease money, the tanks, the fuel. Churchill will have to fire Montgomery. The hero of El Alamein will be sent home in disgrace, labeled the man who nearly wrecked the victory. "Type it up," Eisenhower says. "Get it ready to send." The typist's keys clack in the quiet room. Each keystroke is a hammer blow to the career of Bernard Montgomery. But there was one man in the room who wasn't ready to let the alliance burn, Major General Francis Freddie de Guingond. De Guingond was Montgomery's chief of staff. He was the unsung hero of the British Army. If Montgomery was the brilliant but abrasive genius, Freddie was the translator. For years, he had smoothed over Monty's insults, cleaned up his messes, and apologized to the Americans on his behalf. He was charming, popular, and utterly exhausted. He was living on nervous energy and pills, sick with a respiratory infection, worn down by the stress of managing his boss. He happened to be visiting Shave when the crisis broke. Bedell Smith pulled him aside and showed him the draft of the firing cable. "It's over, Freddie," Smith said. "The old man is sending it. Monty is finished." De Guingond read the cable. The blood drained from his face. He saw the disaster clearly. It wasn't just about Monty's career. It was about the morale of the British people. To fire their hero now, at the climax of the war, it would be a national trauma. "Give me 24 hours, de Guingamp begged. Smith shook his head. "It's too late. 24 hours, de Guingamp insisted. "Let me fly to him. Let me show him this. If he doesn't recant, if he doesn't fix this completely, then send it. But give him the chance to see the gun at his head." Eisenhower looked at de Guingamp. He liked Freddie. Everyone liked Freddie. He looked at the clock. "You have 24 hours. De Guingamp rushed to the airfield. The weather was atrocious, blizzard conditions, zero visibility. No planes were flying. De Guingamp found a pilot willing to risk a court-martial and a crash. They took off into the white void. The flight was a nightmare. The small plane was tossed like a leaf in the gale. They navigated by dead reckoning, hoping they wouldn't slam into a church steeple or a hillside. They landed at a forward airstrip in Belgium, skidding on the ice, barely stopping before the runway ended. De Guingamp jumped into a jeep. He was feverish, shaking from his illness and the cold. He raced through the snow-choked roads to Zonhoven. He arrived at Montgomery's tactical headquarters late at night. The atmosphere inside was calm, orderly. Montgomery was sitting with his staff, looking pleased with himself. He had no idea. He was completely insulated in his bubble of self-righteousness. He thought the Americans were annoyed, perhaps, but he had no concept of the volcano he had triggered. De Guingamp walked in. He didn't salute, he didn't smile. "What's the matter, Freddie?" Montgomery asked. "You look terrible." "You have to look at this," de Guingamp said. He slammed the transcript of the press conference and the draft of Eisenhower's cable onto the table. "It's your resignation, sir." Montgomery picked up the papers. He read the transcript. For the first time he saw his words through American eyes. He saw the arrogance. Then he read Eisenhower's cable. He stopped. The room went silent. Montgomery was vain, but he was not stupid. He knew the geopolitical math. He knew that Britain was bankrupt. He knew the Americans were the senior partner now. He looked at the ultimatum, him or me. He looked up at de Guingamp. The arrogance vanished. The master of the battlefield was gone. In his place was a man who realized he had walked to the edge of a cliff. "What do I do, Freddie?" he asked. His voice was small. Quiet. De Guingamp had the answer ready. He had already drafted the response in his head on the terrifying flight over. "You sign this," de Guingamp said, "and you send it. Now, no changes, no arguments." It was a letter of total, abject surrender. It read, "Dear Ike, I am distressed that my press conference has caused such a stir. I would never want to do anything that would hurt the feelings of the Americans. I am absolutely devoted to you, your very devoted subordinate, Monty." Your subordinate. Montgomery signed it. He handed it to de Guingamp. De Guingamp didn't wait. He ran back to the jeep, back to the plane, and flew back into the storm. Back at Versailles, Eisenhower was still at his desk. The cable to Marshal was still there, waiting to be sent. The door opened. De Guingamp stumbled in, looking like a ghost. He placed Montgomery's letter on the desk. Eisenhower picked it up. He read it slowly. He let out a long breath. The tension in his shoulders dropped. He didn't want to fire Montgomery. He didn't want the scandal. He didn't want the history books to say the alliance failed. He just wanted to win the war. He looked at Bedell Smith. "This will do," he said. He took the draft of the firing cable, the document that would have changed the course of history, and he crumpled it up. "File the letter," Eisenhower said. "Let's get back to work." The crisis was over. The 1st and 9th Armies were returned to Bradley a few days later. The Allies crossed the Rhine. The Nazis surrendered in May, but the scar remained. Omar Bradley never truly forgave Montgomery. He refused to shake his hand for months. Patton went to his grave despising him. The special relationship between the US and UK military commands remained frosty for the rest of the war, but the alliance held.